Thank you for pressing start on episode 4 of Underplayed, KZUM's indie video game podcast. Today we have a couple of secret games to review, followed by a cooperative look at this episode's featured game, Axiom Verge. I'm Bopo. Joining me is my player 2, DiscoCola. How are you, Disco?
Doing great. I'm really excited about what we're talking about today because it's one of my favorite subgenres of game.
Yes, we're talking about Axiom Verge. We're talking about Metroidvanias today. You were wanting to pick a secret game to coincide with Axiom Verge. That is a Metroidvania game. So we'll get to that in a second. But first, I have to set up Underplayed. This is our show where we review indie games of all kinds, the games with small budgets but big hearts, the lesser-known experiences with imaginative ideas. Let's begin with our secret games.
Secret games. Secret games. Secret games. Secret games.
Secret Games is our segment where we each review one indie game we've been playing in secret since our last podcast recording. We do not discuss our picks in advance and have no idea what the other person has played. And our only rule here is that we choose games that we haven't reviewed on the podcast before. We will start with you, DiscoCola. Let the mystery be no more. What is your secret game for episode 4 of Underplayed?
My secret game is Watum.
It is not. I don't believe you. I don't believe you. You already tried that once.
I'm going to try it again.
Even if it genuinely is your secret game, I'm never going to believe you.
My secret game is not Watum.
Okay. You actually had me there for a second. I thought oh no, did I just, yeah.
So I just sent you the trailer. My secret game is actually The Mummy Demastered.
Oh, you've talked about this with me before.
I have talked about this game with you
Mummy
before.
Demastered, based on not the Mummy movie from the 90s, but the Mummy movie we got in like 2017, right?
Yes.
Okay, because I never saw that, and I have not played this game, so this is completely new to me. All I know is that it's a Metroidvania game.
Yes.
So go on that.
I have also not seen that movie myself. I just know a little bit about it. The Mummy Demastered, its existence is sort of like a comedy in and of itself. So like Bopo mentioned, it is technically a licensed game for the 2017 Tom Cruise film, The Mummy, from developer WayForward. So like when you boot it up, you still get the Universal, logo at the beginning.
Interesting.
It is a licensed game.
Huh.
However, you don't play as, see, or even reference whatever Tom Cruise's character is at all. Instead, you play as a nameless prodigium agent, which I assume is just like the name of the organization that is like looking for the mummy in the movies.
Okay.
Instead of being on sort of like a high budget CG Fest tier type of game, this game takes a side-scrolling pixel art approach, and so thus the word Demastered officially in the title. The only other references to the film are maybe the setting. I assume Russell Crowe's likeness appears as his character, Dr. Henry Jekyll. He sort of serves as your tutorial, like director character. And then Aminette, who is the mummy, appears in the game. But her visual appearance is so small that it barely resembles the actress that played her in the movie. But it is still something else that's referenced from the film. This game plays like most side-scrolling Metroidvanias, with a map like most Metroidvanias and collectibles that improve your skills and firepower. So in a world full of Metroidvanias, what kind of sets this apart? To be honest, not a lot. I would say the sprite work is pretty premium compared to a lot of indie Metroidvanias. Most specifically, I would say the background and environments are particularly well crafted compared to a lot of Metroidvanias that tend to look a little bit more repetitive. Music in this game from Monomer is awesome. I've listened to a few of the tracks in the past, like several times before I played it. But now that I have played it and heard all the rest of the songs, I intend to listen to the full score just for fun. And then the actual gameplay is also really well done. It's not totally uncommon for Metroidvanias to have movement speed or jump physics that don't totally match the character's environment. But the physics in this game feel just right, really intuitive. And as your character grows more powerful, those physics grow with you in an appropriate way, I would say. The game also really succeeds at obstacles. So this game does a really good job of introducing you to a lot of the impassable obstacles pretty early on, and it telegraphs pretty well like what kind of object you might need or upgrade you might need in order to pass these obstacles. But the one thing that sets it apart the most is one of the main game mechanics. So earlier I'd mentioned that you play as a nameless agent of Prodigium, which is very much tied into this game's like selling mechanic, and that is if you die, your corpse is reanimated and becomes an enemy for the next faceless, nameless Prodigium agent to fight, and then you get to capture all of the items that you had on you when you died.
Interesting.
So this reanimated corpse is using, your tier 2 weapon or whatever against you as this Zambo. So
interesting. Not to reference non-indie games too much on this show, but that's reminiscent of when you die in a Soulsborne game like, Bloodborne, and your dropped blood echoes are sometimes laying there on the floor when you go to retrieve them, or they're actually inside an enemy and you have to defeat that enemy.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have like your powers necessarily, but there's an incentive to go back and like find that person.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's the case here. You have to find your previous incarnation and take them down in order to retrieve some of the things that you had in your past life. So frankly, those are a lot of the most important components to a good Metroidvania, and The Mummy Demastered performs those in a satisfactory to even a proficient manner in most cases. One of the other complaints that I have is with collectibles, and it's sort of, I have a small gripe with it, and it's a symptom of the game overall. I honestly find the game to be a little too grounded in reality, and this extends to collectibles. So you do get to find these like cool Egyptian themed collectibles that boost your abilities, like you're able to jump, or you can traverse a flat ceiling like it's monkey bars, or walk through water. But that's kind of as crazy as it gets. Like there's one power up that feels maybe a little supernatural, but everything else is just like amplified human abilities, if that makes sense. And that it's the same with the weapons. Like one of the guns is a shotgun. I think I maybe used it once, but like all of your weapons, with one exception, are just normal-ish guns. And so I could have gone for something a little crazier, a little more just out of this world. It would have felt at home in a Metroidvania, I think. One of my other nitpicks is also a symptom of that, and that's the in-world enemies. Again, a little too grounded in reality. Most of your common enemies are grasshoppers, or rabid dogs, or angry wolves, or bats. So zombies is as crazy as most of the in-world enemies get. So at times it felt like a little bit like a NES game that just had to throw something familiar in so that you could actually recognize what you were looking at with 17 pixels to work with. But,
sure.
And the cutscene text, man, that stuff moves way too fast. Like there was about a third of the cutscene text that I couldn't read. So I guess to wrap this all up, I would give this game an 8.5 out of 10.
Wow.
Yeah, it's short. It's fun to play. The difficulty's not too punishing. The bosses look pretty cool, and I can see myself turning this on for fun. And even though the Universal Cinematic Monster universe is dead, as far as I know, I wouldn't totally hate seeing a series of way forward Metroidvania games that are loosely based on those monsters, like the Invisible Man or Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Okay. So I have a question for you. I'm someone who, if there's something that's licensed, especially like a game, it's hard for me to get on the wavelength of that game unless I'm really into the original license. Like lots of video game movies are bad, but sometimes it's the other way around where like games are based on movies, and those can be really bad too. Some of them are good though. But I really am more attached. It's easier for me to get attached if I have an original attachment to whatever it's based on. So as someone who has not played probably as many Metroidvanias as you, would you still recommend this one to me if I'm not a fan of The Mummy?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I
sounds
haven't
like where
seen the
you're
movie,
going.
and I think just by putting the word Demastered in the title is sort of like a tongue-in-cheek way at saying like, hey, this movie sucks, but you can still play
Gotcha.
this game. It's pretty much totally unrelated.
Cool.
And I think it's just like on its face, like an unrelated property.
Yeah, they're very much self-aware about how the movie is perceived by many audiences.
Yeah.
I'm looking at this game. So every time we reveal a secret game, at that very moment, whoever's turn it is sends a gameplay trailer to the other person so we can watch what the other person is talking about as they talk about it. And I'm looking at this launch trailer for The Mummy Demastered. Around the 51-second mark, I'm looking at this scene that looks like it's from Castlevania. And so I'm just seeing like this clock tower looking area. You're fighting a big creature. There's gears all around. That just screams Castlevania to me. If there are lots of environments like that, I think I would really dig this.
I think thematically it fits in more visually with Castlevania, but it feels a little bit more like a Metroid game.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's see. I played this on PS4.
Looks like you can play it on Switch, on PC, and Xbox One
Yes.
as well. Very cool. That is DiscoCola's secret game, The Mummy Demastered. He rated it an 8.5 out of 10, which is pretty high praise. That's one of the highest scores we've given so far here, 4 episodes deep into Underplayed. My turn for secret game. Now I have to give a little caveat here. This is actually a game that I loosely talked about having as a cooperative review game with you. We talked about it mostly in textual chats.
Okay.
And I'll give a little bit of it away right now. It's a game that just released, and I don't think we ever came to a firm decision on whether it would be a cooperative review game. I think
I know which one you're talking about.
I think we might have informally said like, oh yeah, that could work, but we never really added it to our list that we're working off of. And what happened was the release date of this was looming, and I decided to look into it more because I thought the game looked really interesting. Looked into it, and then I had this feeling that it would work better as a secret review game.
Okay.
And so that's what I did. I kind of took the reins a little bit, and I decided to pick Hoa as my secret game.
Oh, that is not what I thought you were talking about.
So this game, a lot of people call it Hoa. It's a Vietnamese developed game, and I think the correct pronunciation is something along the lines of Hoa. So I'm going to try Hoa here in this review. Hoa is a 2021 side-scrolling platformer where you play as the titular Hoa, a fairy who seeks to find her way home and awaken her allies from a magical slumber. So like I said, this was eye-catching to me. It's an indie title that has very distinct hand-painted art. Many people online are saying the visuals remind them of a Studio Ghibli film. So if you're a fan of those films, I think you'll understand what people mean when they give that assessment. I agree with that assessment. I think that assessment applies to the environments and the character designs in this game. It's very pretty. The colors are lush. Much of it looks so calm and peaceful. And it's all made much more dynamic with some great parallax effects going on. And because it's Vietnamese developed, there are a lot of those influences in how the game looks. Now, in this game, Hoa, the fairy, goes through her journey and she navigates these stages that require her to jump and grab and solve very light puzzles. And the gameplay loop kind of works like this. When you arrive in a new level, you have to collect 5 butterflies, and you have to use them to activate a magical symbol. Which awakens a large creature in that area who is an ally of some sort from Hoa's past. And then these creatures can be anything from like a caterpillar with luminescent wings to a forest sage with giant antlers. There's one who's an octopus with 3 very distinct eyes. So they have very interesting designs. And each ally gives Hoa an ability of some kind that allows her to access the next area. So it might kind of sound Metroidvania-y, but you can't really backtrack to previous stages or anything like that. So it's much more directed in its approach to guiding you through the game. The game is gorgeous to look at from start to finish. But since this is a platformer, I also have to talk about the aspects of this game that actually made me glad I didn't pursue it further as a potential cooperative review game alongside you, Disco. So first, I have to mention repetition of this game because each of the stages follows the same formula very closely. And that formula really starts to announce itself by like stage 2 or 3, making the gameplay loop feel really tired quite quickly. So you start to anticipate how these stages will play out, and rarely does the game deviate from this formula. Next criticism I have is that the gameplay feels quite shallow. There's not a lot of challenge to collect the butterflies in each stage, other than taking the time to explore the maps, and each stage only takes like 15 minutes to complete. All the butterflies are also revealed on your map from the start, so there's no question about where you should go, and it's very difficult to get lost or sidetracked. And then there are some other miscellaneous issues, such as the controls don't always feel that tight. There's very noticeable freezing when transitioning between screens, which really shouldn't happen because this is not a game that should tax any hardware, so it feels like it's just not optimized correctly. And then the music, which is often peaceful and very calming and features piano that's very beautiful, it can start to get repetitive. The map is clumsy to open. The dialogue text can be really small and hard to read. Each of these frustrations are pretty harmless on their own, but when you add them together, they really do add up over the course of the journey for me. I will say, though, that while I do have negatives, I did recognize a virtue in how beautiful and risk-free this game is. It was, for the most part, a calming experience. So I never felt like my brain was put to work that much, and I enjoyed the art. And I feel like there's value in that, especially for times when we need to de-stress and play something carefree that offers no deaths and little challenge. And very importantly, this is a very short experience. You can finish it in just a few hours. It took me 2 hours to not only finish it, but complete it and do all the tasks necessary to get the platinum on PlayStation. So for me, Hoa worked less as a memorable platformer and perhaps more as a beautiful meditation tool in the moment I was playing it. The pattern of its gameplay does get repetitive, but it would be perfect for parents wanting to play something simple with their young child, for instance, or maybe for those looking for a breezy, stress-reducing experience. After you play it, though, I wouldn't expect the game to stick around in your mind, and it really did not for me. So I give Hoa a 5.5 out of 10.
Oh, dang.
Yeah. So do you remember talking about this game with me? I think I had sent you a trailer when we were kind of in the early stages of thinking about doing Underplayed. We thought, oh, we could maybe do this. Does this game look familiar to you? Or
I remember the aesthetic, the design. I remember like the thumbnail that you sent me, but I don't remember like if I watched the trailer. I don't remember it.
Okay.
And I'm sure I did watch it, but watching what I watched, the thing that stands out a little bit more is the design, the aesthetic, but also like insects. I'm a big, I love insects, and when they can be incorporated into games in a meaningful way, I'm a fan of that.
There are lots of insects in this game. There's, in that trailer, you probably saw like forest stages. There's actually a forest stage that it's your first stage you go to, and then I think you return to it after a few stages, but it's a different area and maybe different time of day. And there's some interesting, platforming sections where there are these like ladybugs, I think, that land on a tree, and you have to jump on the ladybugs with the right timing before they fly away. That was probably some of the most challenging platforming, and it's very simple timing puzzles that you've seen in very basic platforming sections in other games.
I just saw a little bit of that. I assumed that it was based on when you jumped. It didn't look like the timing was difficult. I thought it was the trigger was the jump.
Oh yeah,
that made them fly away.
Yeah, it's more of a rhythm thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So from what I see, correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of feels a little bit less like a Metroidvania and more like a Gree. It feels a little bit more like Gree, just watching what I saw.
Yeah, like I said, you cannot backtrack to previous levels. When you complete a stage and they're 15 or 20 minutes maybe, you're done with that stage and you move on to the next one. And total there are, maybe around 6 to 7 stages. And so that's why it takes 2 hours. Mm-hmm. You can sit down and do this in one sitting. I actually took a break partway through, and it all told, I think the time tracker on PSN Profiles says my platinum took like 2 hours and 19 minutes, but I took about a 20-minute break in the middle. So it took a good 2 hours flat to do all the tasks for all the trophies. So yeah. So that's Hoa. I'd say If you are looking for a calming, relaxing experience, I would still recommend this game to you. If you're looking for a challenging platformer, I think maybe try to find something a little bit more challenging than this game. So those are our secret games. Let's move on to our cooperative review of this episode's headlining game, Axiom Verge. So Axiom Verge is playable on a lot of consoles. It's on Windows, Mac, Linux, PS4, Xbox One, Wii U, and PlayStation Vita. It is a 2015 Metroidvania game where you play as Trace, a scientist who wakes up on the alien world of Sudra after an explosion on Earth. In his quest to discover why he's there, Trace meets several Razalki, which are sentient war machines who guide him in his fight against hostile monsters. And notably, the game was developed by one person, Thomas Happ. This is a game from Thomas Happ Games, all the development by a sole individual with some publishing duties enlisting the help of some other people. But that is pretty incredible when you experience this game, especially if you don't know it going in, and then you look back at what you just played and you think, wow, the music, the sound effects, the art, the gameplay, the everything about the game, one person. So Disco, this is a game that we've each been playing recently, but where we differ is that you had beaten this game previously, whereas I was coming into this fresh for Underplayed. And 4 episodes deep into Underplayed, this is the first time this has happened, and it certainly won't be the last where one of us has played the featured game, but we will always vow to both play the game in close proximity to our episode recording of that game. So since you have played Axiom Verge before, I want to know how long this game has been occupying your mind, and then if you could go into your overall thoughts of what it was like to re-experience Axiom Verge for this podcast.
Okay, yeah, that's a great setup. I would say it's been on my mind for a long time in the sense that I have failed to go back to it and clean up the rest of the trophies that I need to get. I'm still missing a 30% on the trophy profile. And so going back to it, I chose to tackle one of the more difficult trophies that I still had remaining.
Okay.
And I chose to play the run of the game where you have to finish the game with 40% of your items or less. And so that created a brand new experience for me. I would say this time around, I focused way less on the story and more on the task, which I found to be at many points frustratingly difficult.
Okay, so just to set up the 40% run, in Axiom Verge, you can collect all kinds of items. Some are weapons, some are basically extending the range of your weapon. Some are little add-ons to the character of Trace, like arms that shoot extra bullets out of you when you're at full health. All of those are considered in this 40% run, wherein you have to collect 40% or less of the total available items. And that also goes for like health upgrades too.
Yes.
So you have to be very selective about what you're picking up. You can't just pick up even every single weapon. And there are lots of weapons in this game.
There's like 24 or more, I think. So one of the other things that I've been trying to do for Underplayed, especially with stuff that I haven't played before, is try to not look up a guide. I try to go into these games fresh to give myself the freshest experience possible. And I did that with this 40% run. It's been 3 years since I played it the first time, and I haven't played it since. And so going through this 40% run, I didn't remember like what weapons were the most optimal in what situations. I didn't even remember most of the bosses.
Yeah, you probably didn't remember the paths of where to go after getting certain
not even
upgrades.
close.
Right? So,
yeah, I found myself getting stuck a few times. I tried to focus on stuff that was required to traverse, and just trying to get to the end. And man, when you can't collect health upgrades or some of the most optimal weapons, it makes for a very, very challenging experience. When I finally got to the end, it said that I had died, I think, 111 times.
Oh my.
So very difficult. And I guess my overall thoughts are tied into why I wanted the game in the first place. I think visually, Axiom Verge is an incredibly appealing game. It has a lot of the things that I wanted from Mummy Demastered. Wacky enemies, in worlds that have unusual behavior that you kind of have to figure out. A little bit more in the realm of supernatural elements in the world itself, like such as glitching out some of the walls to find hidden paths. I find that really enjoyable to a point. And testing different things on different enemies to change their behavior is really fun. And I think visually the overworld sprite work looks beautiful. In the case of like cutscene sprite work, I felt that left a little bit to be desired and kind of reminded me of some of the amateur work I would see when I used to dabble in sprite work at the age of like 13, 14. So it didn't feel like totally professional, but I also understand that Thomas Happ is one person and is doing all these things. And it could just be like his style. That just some of the shading and the sprite work felt a little bit rudimentary, I would say, compared to some of the other stuff that I've seen just in other sprite-based video games. The other thing is that there's not a lot of characters to like or dislike, but by the end of the game, I found myself kind of disliking Trace a little bit. Not for anything in particular, but just there's something about the ending and the character of Trace in the ending that felt pretentious somehow.
Any other overall thoughts?
No, I mean, I think it's a good game and it's earned its place. I feel that it's earned its place in the pantheon of Metroidvanias and indie games as a whole. But yeah, it's not my favorite game, and it didn't totally meet the high expectations I had for it when I sought it out as my second ever PS4 game. But it's still quite fun, and some of the trophies that you're required to get add challenges that you wouldn't otherwise impose upon yourself.
Yeah. If you can optimize all of your runs, you can do this in 2 playthroughs if you want to get that platinum trophy, for instance. But you will have to play the game in uncomfortable ways, I would say.
Yeah, I am not skilled enough to, I think, optimize to the point of getting it done in 2 runs.
Yeah. When I talk about my overall thoughts, just keep in the back of your mind that I played the 100% hard playthrough. So I was actually not being selective with what I was picking up. I was trying to collect as much as I could, and I was also required to backtrack quite a lot in my experience. So just keep that in mind. Very important question for you. What do you rate Axiom Verge out of 10 on our 20-point scale?
I'm going to say, I think I'm going to keep it at a 7. Music's good. Visuals are great. A lot of the upgrades you get feel good. The physics are good. There's just a few things that I dislike. I find myself getting stuck a little bit too often. Not always telegraphed totally well where you're supposed to find required items. Sound effect design is something that stands out in my mind as being particularly good as well. So yeah, just a few problems visually, story-wise, but also love visually, progression, needed a little help. So
my overall thoughts, Axiom Verge is basically Metroid with more weapons and more plot. That's what it is to me. It so closely resembles a Metroid game that I would actually almost be more comfortable calling this a Metroid game over a Metroidvania game, if that makes sense. It is pure homage to Metroid. I think that's very apparent to lots of people who have played this game. A standout part of Axiom Verge is the design of some of the larger creatures. So I really liked the boss fights in this game.
Boss fights are good.
Boss fights look incredible. They're fun to play. And I really liked the design of the Rizalki too. The Rizalki in particular have these eye-catching humanoid faces and very mechanical bodies. And there's something that's like beautiful about them, but also grotesque that just makes you not able to stop looking. And then back on the boss fights, there are just the right amount of them, and they are balanced in such a way that they feel very manageable, but they're also very satisfying once they're defeated. Also, for some of them, the field of view zooms out because the scale of the monster is so large and impressive. I also appreciated that no matter your playstyle, there's probably a weapon in the game that you're sure to find and love. But at the same time, I think there are too many weapons in this game, and having so many of them can kind of cheapen the experience of finding something new. I really appreciated this game for what it was, a loving tribute to Metroid with lots of secrets to find and fun equipment to use, but a big bulk of the game felt like it dragged on for me. Part of that is some of the trouble I had finding the next place to go, kind of like what you were talking about. The game doesn't always spell it out super clearly. I wish there was more of that telegraphing. I know this is the nature of Metroidvanias, that it can be a puzzle or a challenge to find out where to go. But in Axiom Verge, it's a problem for me because the core of experimenting and finding where you're supposed to go depends on backtracking, and the backtracking in this game is unsatisfying for me. There are no simple ways to navigate around, and traveling to check out a possible route can take a long time, and there can be this ever-growing sense of staleness as you explore and re-explore your options. I know older Metroidvania games did things the hard way like this, but I feel like modern takes on the genre carry this expectation that there should be something like a fast travel system. But having to go backwards on foot in a lot of cases and re-explore the same corridors and passageways, it just kind of got old for me at times. There's also this reliance on using this area called Kerr. And I don't know if Kerr sounds familiar to you, if you know which area this is. It's one of my least favorite locations. It has grating music, some of the game's most tedious navigation for me. It has a lot of variance in how it looks because it's a very vertical part of the world, but we're forced to go there multiple times right in the middle, and it's so central to the progression that I just got tired of that area specifically. Controls can be frustrating as Trace gains more abilities. I never had confidence about how the grapple worked. I'm sorry. I just didn't. I feel like there weren't enough parts of the animation to tell me where I was supposed to let go of the button. Do you relate to that?
It is only like a 5-frame animation, but at times I feel like that's a little bit simpler for me.
Nor did the dash ability ever feel natural for me. A double tapping the directional pad in one direction never works. It should never be used. It's not good. I played most of this game actually with the stick. And when I got to the part where dash becomes core to navigating a lot of the puzzles, I had to switch to the directional pad because using the stick, I would accidentally dash so much. And then just having to do that double tap, especially when you're in the middle of a run, is really hard for me to do. I just don't have fun doing that. Also, the story for me is convoluted. It feels like 3 seasons of a sci-fi series packed into one 8-hour experience. There's a lot of exposition that's dumped that feels needless. You never really get a ton at once, but when you try to piece together what the story is and means, I just get lost. I just don't really relate to stories where there's alternate universes and various timelines and non-linearity. That's what this game is. If you eat that stuff up, you're going to have a lot of story to unpack in this game. So those are story turnoffs for me. Maybe they won't be for you. Overall, I did like my time with Axiom Verge, especially the boss fights and discovering those intricate character designs. The game can give you some fun options for weapons. We've talked about the glitching stuff a little bit. I really like hacking enemies. That kind of makes things more dynamic. That's fun. The story was a turnoff for me in almost every way. And the tedium in the middle third of the game was a detriment to my motivation to see the rest at times, but I did see it through to the end. I'm glad I stuck it out, but Axiom Verge as a whole, for me, it is not as good as the excellent games to which it's playing homage. And so for those reasons, I'm going to give this game the same score I gave Hoa, 5.5 out of 10.
Okay, I was stuck somewhere between 6.5 and 7. I wanted to go back to something that you had talked about in terms of backtracking and progression.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take a long time in the game for you to get to a point where you can use multiple methods to traverse certain types of gaps. So you unlock something that's called the drone. You can use that instead of maybe the grapple or instead of maybe the jump. So when you backtrack, you try these things and they're not working, but you feel like they should. It's hard to know what you're missing, I would say.
Yeah. I felt like I never got the launching of the drone down. You can launch it straight up and you can let it out of its shell and then kind of go a little bit left or right, depending on if you need to catch the edge of a platform. But it was just a lot of coordination to have to do to master that.
Yeah.
And the game introduces all these mechanics and you use them to solve like a puzzle or two, but not enough that you feel confident to then revisit old areas and see them in a new way.
Right. That makes sense.
There are also other mechanics with the weapons that I wish were used more. Early on, you get a weapon called the Nova, where you shoot a large projectile, and then in the middle of its path, you can press the fire button again, and it explodes in this kind of spray.
Six directional spray.
Yeah, it's a spray. And you can use it to launch into like a crevice and activate a switch. You activate the spray. Once it goes into the crevice, it activates a switch that you otherwise wouldn't be able to access. And I felt like mechanics like that were introduced, but then just kind of abandoned. It's like, that's really interesting. I like when Metroid makes me think about how I can use my weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And like I'm getting these tools, but they're things like the grapple hook. They're not things I can defeat enemies with. I have to think of my tools and my weapons as separate things eventually because they abandon using the weapons as tools idea. There's another one, I forget what it's called, but it's the green kind of like short range burst weapon. It's like the third weapon you get.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, I forget the name of it.
Very important for my 40% run, by the way.
Yes, that's a crucial weapon, right? And it's an essential weapon because you need it to progress. There is an early puzzle where you collect that weapon. What you find out about this weapon is it's the first weapon that can clip through walls. You can use it to hit enemies that are on the other side of a barrier. The barrier has to be pretty thin, but you use that to activate another switch. Because otherwise you cannot hit this switch that's just completely enclosed. And then you learn, oh, that's how I can use this weapon. And I guess it's more of a way of teaching me that this can hit an enemy through a wall. But I would have liked seeing like some of the weapons I get later in the game. What if they had unique properties about them, like shooting electricity to activate like an electric panel, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And, oh, I need that weapon. That very specific weapon. It can't just be any of the other 20 weapons that I collect that activates this thing. So
here's something for any listeners that might have a brain like me. Weapons do not have a set order on your little wheel or your inventory. So they are set out in the order you collect them,
mm-hmm.
which is really annoying for someone like me that needs to find meaning in everything or have like a specific pattern for a air quote complete profile.
Yeah, and
so
you can't rearrange them.
You can't rearrange them. So throwing that out there for anyone that might have a disease-riddled brain like myself.
It has the number of weapons of a Ratchet and Clank game without the ability to customize your weapon wheel, which was infuriating. And using the right stick on a controller to select one of the 22 weapons or something that you get, it is really frustrating to try to get to the one you want, because when you get that many, it's just these little fine movements of the stick to select the one. And I would usually pick the wrong one and I'd go, dang it. And it pauses the game whenever you do it.
And I don't like doing R-stick selection anyway, personally.
Yeah.
But
so I think things like the grapple and weapon selection, and in some cases the drone, could have been improved with some like control adjustments. Oh, and especially the dash, like the dash.
Yeah,
just
no,
needs
you're
to
right.
be
I remember
one button press.
I remember on the stream when I was playing it, and I remember specifically that I had been drinking that night, and I was very upset at the dash. I'm like, double tap dash is terrible and should never be.
We should forget that as video gamers, as video game designers. That never works. We should just abandon that. Doesn't work. Wanted to ask you, you said you didn't follow the story as closely this time, but did the story click for you at all? Like with the stuff Trace discovers about himself and what this planet is and what the breach is and how it separates parts of the universe. Did you click with all of that? Because a lot of that stuff I kind of just get turned off by.
I mean, to me, a lot of the breach and stuff like that sounds like a lot of sci-fi nonsense, but a lot of the stuff about Trace and his revelation, close to the end of the game, it reminded me of a lot of how I felt about BioShock Infinite. Again, referencing AAA games. Sorry. But it reminded me of this thing that was trying really hard to be like profound or like just this like incredible twist. When really it wasn't. I guess that's what I mean when it just felt pretentious because it wasn't as deep as I think it was trying to be, or it took itself more seriously than I felt that it was. that twist just is not a great twist, I think.
Yeah. And then the ending is different depending on, oddly enough, the number of items you collect, your completion percentage. Is that correct?
That's not totally unusual for a Metroidvania.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah. Because that's how we knew who Samus was, you know, in one of the early games.
Yeah.
You know, you needed a high completion to figure out like what she looked like underneath the armor and stuff. So another way that this game pays homage to that very excellent game, Metroid and Super Metroid, I would argue. So how does this game compare to like other Metroidvania games? You know, you talked about The Mummy Demastered. You have played Forma 8 for this show. Like, is this one you would recommend to newcomers to the genre?
There are better ones to start with, I would say. It's called Metroidvania for a reason. You know, start with some of those. I would even say that The Mummy Demastered is probably the most accessible Metroidvania game I've played, even including Metroids and Castlevanias. It's difficulty is not too punishing, but just enough to feel rewarding for accomplishing the game. I think it's good, and you should play it for the legacy that it has. And it's certainly not a bad game.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. Visually, it's you know, very appealing. It does some daring stuff. Yeah, there's cool mechanics that other Metroidvanias don't totally have. And like I enjoy playing with the drone. I think drone's very fun to use. So yeah, I recommend that you try it. But it's not an entry point. It's not an entry point Metroidvania.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there. I was a little bit harsher with the game, but I'm glad I saw it to the end. I think playing the original games it's kind of based on is necessary for gamers. And there is an Axiom Verge 2 that, as of this recording, kind of just recently came out. So that
just out of nowhere too.
Yeah,
like we knew it was coming eventually, but no date had been set, and they were just like, surprise.
I feel like it's kind of gone under the radar this year in you know, games news and journalism and stuff like that. So we might check that one out on a future episode of Underplayed. We'll see.
I had somebody drop into the stream that was like, you know, Axiom Verge 2 isn't that bad. You should try it out.
Yeah, it's from what little I've seen, it does look like it's quite a bit different, at least visually. So we'll maybe check that out on a future episode. But that'll bring us to the end of this episode of Underplayed. DiscoCola, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
That's our review of Axiom Verge. You can play it on Wii U, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation Vita, PS4, Xbox One, PC, Mac, and Linux. Disco rated it a 7. I rated it a 5.5. That's the end of this episode of Underplayed. You can find more of our episodes at kzum.org/underplayed. Our music was composed by Jack Rodenberg. Our art comes from Onimochi. My name's Bopo, and you can find me on Twitter at Bopo. That's BO_PO.
And I'm DiscoCola. You can find me on Twitter and streaming most nights of the week on Twitch.
Next time, we'll have 2 more secret games. In our featured review, we'll cover Bug Snacks, an adventure game developed by Young Horses.
Bug Snack.
Until then, everyone, keep on playing.